You are watching me, Mick, here on my YouTube channel, Movies TV Mad. You can also follow me on X at Movies TV Mad and on Instagram, Movies TV Mad X. Welcome to my daily 30-minute video, and today we're talking about professional critics taking joy and happiness over ripping apart Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire. It's important to say that this was originally meant to be a 4-hour movie, not two movies, right? Not a two-part movie. But Scott Stuber, the boss over at Netflix, didn't like the idea of one 4-hour movie, getting terrible flashbacks to Zack Snyder's Justice League Snyder Cut, where a lot of people couldn't finish the 4-hour movie. Some people came back and watched it in bits and pieces, and, it did do well at the time, but, Netflix didn't want that same situation. But what happens is you're splitting up one movie, and I'm going to assume that part 2 of Rebel Moon is more action-packed, it's got more action, it's faster paced, and one of the things about Rebel Moon Part 1, A Child of Fire, it's very slow, it's developing the characters, it's developing its narrative, and it's taking its time. In a lot of ways, it seems like it's taking its time on purpose because there's not much story there to get through, so it needs to take its time. I think as a 4-hour movie, you could see it slowly, doing what it needs to do and having time to breathe like the Snyder Cut did. But like this, you've got the first part, and as one critic said, it does have part 1 syndrome. But what happened to developing your characters and developing your narrative and taking your time? Well, we were growing up, that's the type of movies we saw. I don't think this generation would have sat to watch half the movies we did as kids. It's absolutely crazy that one of the biggest box office successes of my generation, or I wouldn't say I was a kid back in the 90s, is the film Home Alone. There's no explosions. Well, there is explosions, but it's not, it's very talky, it's funny, of course things happen. But I just wonder if these days people would have sat in the cinema to watch Home Alone. Tastes and sensibilities have changed. So, I'm very disappointed, especially in the Hollywood Reporter, in the way they review Zack Snyder's movie. Because it's a lot of it is toxicity. They're really, really joyfully tearing this movie apart. Now, one of the criticisms is that it's unoriginal. Yes, it's unoriginal. It was originally pitched as a Star Wars series. So when you watch part 1, as I have, it really does feel very, very Star Warsy. There's lots of blatant rip-offs. I'd like to call inspirations of Star Wars. George Lucas himself taking inspiration from Flash Gordon. So many different existing stories that he admired, storytellers that he admired, right? And it worked. But the thing is with George Lucas, even though he took inspiration from all those things, he told his own original story. He studied the hero and the hero's journey, and George created something fresh and new while being inspired by other things. So even though I don't like the toxic enjoyment they're making from tearing this film apart, a lot of the criticisms from critics are not necessarily wrong. It's just the way they're saying them and the enjoyment they're taking. You don't have to like the director that I love, and I love Zack Snyder, or like his films or the way he does his films, and that's fine. One of the criticisms has come back, the old criticism, of course, that instead of being the joyful kind of gory kind of Army of the Dead, where it's kind of the old like classic Snyder when he first started out, having fun with action and, hardcore storytelling. They don't like Snyder when he gets too self-serious. I don't see what the problem is with a director being serious about their storytelling and telling serious stories. Why does there have to be gags? Why does it have to be silly? There's nothing wrong with that type of storytelling. But why are gags so important to these critics? It seems a bit weird to me. So there's a lot of bad criticisms. Look, I liked Rebel Moon. Rebel Moon isn't The Great Dictator, it isn't The Godfather, it isn't a perfect movie. There are things wrong with it. But at the end of the day, as I said when I first saw it, on this very channel, on this very platform, if you like what Zack does, you're going to love this film. So I love what Zack does, so I like this film. I wouldn't say I loved it, but I liked it. I thought it was a really, really good film. But some of the way I forgot how much professional critics just despise Zack Snyder and his sensibilities. And I mean, when I talk about professional critics, I'm not talking about Roger Ebert or Barry Norman, people who actually understood movies and knew how to talk about movies. Because even when Barry Norman, if you remember him, if you're old enough to remember him, he could be pretty ruthless with his reviews, but it was never done to be mean and unkind. And I mean, you've got to kind of level your criticisms in a way where you think, does this filmmaker deserve this level of toxicity leveled at them? And it's pretty clear Zack Snyder is one of the most unproblematic creatives around right now. Look, Zack Snyder is a very self-indulgent creative, and he makes no apologies for that. Zack's, to coin a phrase from Brie Larson when she was talking about A Wrinkle in Time, when she said it wasn't made for 30, men over 30, and nobody cares what they thought about it. As I said at the time, Brie, not even the people it was supposed to be for liked the movie or even went to support the movie. But to coin her phrase, it wasn't made for critics. It wasn't made for the mainstream audience. Now, surely Netflix must have been aware of this. This is the kind of situation where I kind of think, did Netflix really think this through? Because here's the thing, Netflix have sunk a hell of a lot of money in this movie. And I mean, I think the first film cost about just around 100 million to make, according to Grace Randolph. I'm not quite sure if both projects cost 100 million or maybe 100 million each. I don't know if both movies cost around 200 million. Not bad, but they have spent money. There's a lot of money, and we know Snyder makes very expensive movies, right? No expense spared. He wants his movies to look the best. Quite right too. But the marketing I've seen for this one movie tells you how desperate they are for this to succeed. They've implemented Zack Snyder to create their Star Wars, the Star Wars of Netflix. There's going to be graphic novels. There's going to be animation. There's going to be gaming. It's very ambitious. In fact, they're taking the same course as James Gunn and Safran are doing for DC Universe, where they're really going hell for leather for a cinematic streaming gaming universe, right? It's very ambitious, and it shows belief in the creative you've brought on to do this. But is this what the audience want? Did the audience ask Netflix for this? Do the audience want this? Are the audience going to pay for this marketing and this budget to make these movies and these animated and this animation and this gaming? Is this going to work? Is there an interest in Rebel Moon being a franchise from the mainstream audience? Well, considering Zack, as we said, Zack doesn't make things for that audience, where is the hunger going to come from to buy games, to watch the animation, to immerse themselves in this franchise? Well, it's only going to come from one place, and it's the Snyderverse fans. Now, we know there's a big vocal fan base on social media, especially X. But here's the thing, are they enough of a justification to sink so much money and put so much faith in Zack's vision here? And I'm going to answer that question immediately. No spells no. I really don't think that Netflix have thought this through, because the time of franchises is over, but they won't listen. So they decided to implement Zack Snyder and invest in Zack Snyder and show faith in Zack Snyder's vision to give them a Star Wars. They wanted a Star Wars. So he goes, well, yeah, I love Star Wars as an 11-year-old boy, so I created my own thing, Rebel Moon. Let's do that. So as I say, if you're making something quite cheap like Army of the Dead, that wouldn't have taken as many, kind of as much CG and things like that, and wouldn't have been as expensive. It's okay. People came in, they watched it once, let's be honest about it. I only watched it once. It was good to solid to middling. It was nothing special. It wasn't good, wasn't bad. Critics certainly preferred Army of the Dead than to how they're responding to Rebel Moon. The problem is, I don't like the toxicity and glee and enjoyment they're getting from tearing Rebel Moon apart, but I understand some to a lot of the criticisms. I get it. It's not original. He's not taking what he's inspired by and doing something different with it like George Lucas did with Star Wars. There's not a lot of originality there. I can see who Darth Vader is supposed to be. I can see who Han Solo is supposed to be. It's basically what he's done. What Snyder's done is, right, here's my Han Solo. Korra's my Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia rolled into one. Is it Korra who Sophia Boutella's played? Can't even remember. And Sophia was amazing. It's a good film. Listen, it's a good film. It is Star Wars fan fiction. Let's be honest. And there is a little bit of Game of Thrones, right? But this is what Lucas did with Star Wars. But as I say, Lucas wasn't the best of directors. He's an okay director, right? He's not a bad director. But Lucas's talents were in editing, how things looked. A bit like Zack Snyder. But Lucas was very good at telling a story. So his Star Wars story in 6 films works because he was a great storyteller, a better storyteller and editor than he was a director. That's why he didn't want to do Empire Strikes Back. He didn't want to direct Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. He knew that he's not the best of directors, but Lucas was a genius in telling a story and creating and developing characters. That's where his strength lied. He could take things he was inspired by and create his own world and his own vision. And I don't believe that Zack's really done this here. He's just looked at Star Wars mostly and said, right, okay, yeah. I'm going to just give different names to characters that I saw in Star Wars. Or it's blatant. I mean, there's blatantly lightsabers in this film as well, in this universe. So not only is it not original and it's got Star Wars floating all over it, you can see this was a pitch for a Star Wars series. Now, what I'm surprised about in terms of Zack, why he didn't disguise that, why he didn't make more changes after it wasn't a Star Wars series. I think one of the things with Snyder, if Snyder was around, let's say, when they were making Return of the Jedi, I'm quite sure George Lucas would have said, yeah, this young director, let's get him to direct Jedi, because he'd be perfect, right? If you don't allow him to write the story or have anything to do with the narrative and he's directing it, he can make it look good, his sensibilities are perfect, it would be amazing. Everyone's always said Snyder could direct the hell out of a Star Wars movie. And he could. I don't know if the slow motion would work in Star Wars. You probably wouldn't be able to do that, Zack. But yeah, Zack Snyder is like we just said about George Lucas, that he's a better editor, right? And he's a better storyteller than director. Well, Snyder is a better director than a storyteller. He's a very good director. He's good with cast. He's good with the crew. They all love him. He gets what he needs from them. He's a perfect director. Unfortunately, Zack Snyder's one of these people who's not content with just being a director. He wants to be the storyteller. And this, I think, is when Zack Snyder has been found wanting mostly. I think like 300 was an adaptation that he did really, really well and had good people with him. His original zombie movie that James Gunn wrote as well, I think, with James Gunn's sensibilities and him as a director, I think that really worked. But I think, he's not a writer. He's a director. And I think if Zack could ever accept that, there would be some good partnerships where he could get with some really prolific writers and direct a movie. I think this is what is kind of gone wrong with Rebel Moon. As I say, I like it. But you can tell that there's not an ounce of originality. I like the film. It's a really, really good film. but this isn't going to go down as a classic. I don't believe that this is going to give Netflix the franchise they were after, and this is not good for Netflix. They've sunk a hell of a lot of money into this, and it's like Rebel Moon. Rebel Moon was look, the art of madness is making the same mistakes twice and expecting it the second time around to end up differently. So with Army of the Dead, they tried to create this franchise again because Zack had been successful with a zombie movie in the past. So they did Army of the Dead, then I think they did an animated thing, did they? And then they did that other spin-off with the other guy who played one of the characters in the film. Didn't he direct the movie as well, if I remember rightly? And I don't think that and I don't think that captured imagination. I think it got a few views, but the Army of the Dead franchise hasn't taken off. Let me repeat, it hasn't taken off. They sunk money into Zack Snyder to do it, and it didn't work. So what did they do? They decided, because Scott Stuber, the boss over there at Netflix, really likes Zack. I really like Zack. I want Zack to succeed, but Zack can't tell a story. Zack can direct a story, right? He kind of co-wrote the Snyder Cut, but it was Terrio that did most of the writing for BVS and that. Snyder, if you ask me, the best DC film that he was involved with was Man of Steel, because he didn't write it. Now, yes, he worked with David Goyer, and they may have changed this or that on his behest, but the best film that he did at DC was Man of Steel, because you had a brilliant storyteller like Nolan and Goyer writing that story, and then Goyer writing the script. And that's why the Dark Knight trilogy was so good, because they were in control of that story. And I think when Nolan and Goyer left the building with BVS, Snyder was able to do whatever the fuck he wanted. And that's when the problems began. Not for me. I enjoyed that movie, but it's very different, and it's not for a mainstream audience. Man of Steel appealed more to a mainstream audience. It'd be interesting, actually, how much money, for example, Batman vs. Superman would have made if it wasn't a Batman vs. Superman movie, if it was something else, for example. If it was a Batman origin story written by Terrio and, directed by Snyder. Because clearly, Batman and Superman, it being Batman versus Superman, brought a few more seats at the table. So that would have been interesting if it was just the Batman movie. But yeah, look, Snyder isn't a story. In terms of a director telling a story, he can do that as a director. But he can't. You can't leave him in charge of conducting the narrative. It doesn't work. And, we call Zack a visionary director because visually, he is a visionary director. And as I say, if he's directing something that another writer has done, a really, really, really good prolific writer, it's going to work. If this is a bit of a harsh thing to say, if Snyder actually knew his place as a director, then, I think he would make more friends out of critics, for example. But because a lot of the things they say about him are not untrue. And I mean, you can either be overly biased and not agree with that, or you can actually say, do you know what? He's a really good director, but he isn't a writer. He can't tell a story. And this is the problem with Rebel Moon. The characters are somewhat undercooked. You blatantly see that they're versions of the Star Wars characters, but this is a more adult. This is definitely a more adult Star Wars. And Zack's literally just doing the same things that he's always done, because he's Zack Snyder. Everyone just does those things. So he's done a film that's getting the same criticisms his other films do, and he's even going to have a director's cut, right? So that's interesting, because he always has director's cuts. It will be interesting what critics make from the director's cut compared to this cut. Will they say, actually, this was the film we should have seen? Well, I don't think it's the director's cut we should have seen. I think we should have seen the full 4-hour movie on Netflix. They split one film into two. And as I said earlier, it's pretty clear the second part is more exciting and compelling and has more action, because part one doesn't have as much action than you would imagine it would. So I'm not happy the way critics are taking pride in tearing Zack Snyder to pieces, but at the end of the day, a lot of their criticisms are not necessarily wrong. But did I enjoy the film? Yes, I did. Is it a classic? Yes. Is it better than Man of Steel? No. Is it better than Batman versus Superman? No. You know, I think at this moment in time, it's always going to be his first zombie movie, 300, Watchmen. They're all, you know, Man of Steel, BVS, the Snyder Cut. They're always going to be better than anything else he does. That's what I don't see him doing something that's any better than that. That's just my opinion. But of course, I could be wrong. But so if you're going in to see this and thinking you're going to see the best thing ever, but as I said, if you love Snyder's stuff, you're going to love this stuff. And, you know, you're going to love this film. If you love Snyder's stuff, you're going to love this film. And if you don't like Snyder's stuff, you're not going to like this film. But there are a lot of, you know, I mean, I forgot how much critics hate what he does. I must admit, I forgot. So I was surprised to read the Hollywood Reporter review and how venomous it was within its review. But there's a lot of truth in what they're saying, regrettably. Because, how can I put this? You know, I think you've got to understand your strengths as a creative, as a director. And I think Snyder is insisting in creating something of his very own, because it's pretty clear there's still a lot of pain about what happened at the DCEU. So he took an existing property and, you know, tried to adapt it, make it his own, and some people loved it and some people hated it. So then he came to Netflix and said, right, I'm not going to deal with already, you know, existing properties. I'm going to do something of my own. I don't know if Army of the Dead is based on a comic or whatever. But anyway, you know, Rebel Moon is his. But how much is it his when you can blatantly see that this has Star Wars written all over it? Because as I say, even though we knew Lucas was inspired by Flash Gordon and the rest of it, he still did his own thing. You know, it wasn't blatantly Flash Gordon. I mean, you can't really blatantly see a Flash Gordon-y character in Star Wars. It's just inspired by Flash Gordon. It's inspired by Buck Rogers. But there's no one there that's anything like Buck Rogers. It's just inspired from that type of sci-fi storytelling with something utterly original. And Zack Snyder doesn't do this with Rebel Moon. So if you're happy with the unoriginality, if it doesn't bother you, then it's fine. Unfortunately, this is typical of directors today because they're not as talented as their forefathers, let's say. So they grew up watching all these great movies by these greater directors. So they're so inspired by them, they try and implement what they've already done, and they don't hide it very, very well. This is where we are today. When you hear these modern day directors saying, oh, I took this from this film and that film. But what about you? Where's you in this picture, in this story? And I think what's very interesting is what Zack Snyder in this movie is the visuals, is the visual storytelling. I think that is Snyder, and that's very, very individual and unique. And I think if he gave his Rebel Moon story to the people who wrote it, I don't know. The problem is you can write something with Snyder, but then when he goes to the set and on location, he's going to take that and do whatever the fuck he wants with it, right? So in a lot of ways, he's going to look at their ideas, and if he doesn't kind of think that's what he wants to do, he's Zack Snyder. He's going to go, nah, I'm just going to do my thing here. And that's the problem. You need Zack Snyder to know his place, and you need the writers to do their job. He's not a good writer. It's as simple as that. but he's a bloody great director. That's the thing. He makes Zack Snyder movies visually. That's where his strengths lie. That is where the originality lies. And I think what went wrong with Rebel Moon, if you could call it going wrong, is that he tried to tell his own story. And as I say, Netflix have gone along for the ride because they're looking for it. They're looking for their own Star Wars, because this is why Disney bought Lucasfilm, because they thought, wow, Star Wars, if we could make this our own, look at the money we could make. And they failed because they misunderstood what Star Wars was. And they wanted to put their own ideology, their progressive ideology, into it. Now, Rebel Moon just feels like it's different parts of other Janniers, and Zack didn't try and hide that a little bit more. You can take inspiration, but do something. You know, for example, if you look at the X-Files, it's clear Chris Carter was a bit of an Outer Limits fan, right? But he took those little kind of tales, are they true or not, and then created his own thing. He gave us Mulder and Scully, the FBI, you know, the X-Files. So you can tell that it's a weird, strange story kind of show, but it doesn't copy. It only takes inspiration. You know, and I think the only thing I've ever saw that's totally original is probably Twin Peaks, which is, you know, based on a young woman going missing, but it's done in such a vibrant, you know, way of nuance, and no one's ever done anything like that before. But I think Zack just didn't hide how much inspired he was from Star Wars. You can blatantly see what a lightsaber is, right? And that's the problem. I think it's good to be inspired by things, and I think that's okay, but you've got to hide those inspirations and create something of your own. And I think the problem is today, we're dealing with creatives who are given the power to make stuff that maybe should know their place, should know what they're good at. I mean, and it's the same thing with George Lucas. Everyone knew he wasn't the greatest of director, but because he'd come up with this great story, because A New Hope was so successful, you know, who's going to tell him that? Well, he told himself that. That's why he didn't direct Empire and Jedi. But he did direct the other prequels, and maybe that was the problem with the prequels. Personally, I love the prequels. But that's the thing. Lucas is a better storyteller than director, and Snyder is a better director than storyteller. And I think that's the problem with Hollywood today. There doesn't seem to be anyone like in control of the studios to say, this is your strength. Because what happens is the director kind of usurps them and says, well, you do it my way, I'm not working here. It's like the director of Barbie. We heard her saying, you know, I don't need to make a Barbie movie. I saw her speaking on Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. So you either do it my way or you don't. And I won't do it. And that's the problem today. I think directors have too much authority. Whether, now in the old days, a studio would say to them, these are your strengths, keep to your strengths. And that's the problem. When people are allowed to do things they're not good at, it doesn't work. Don't forget, this is a professional industry that has to make money. You want them to take their strengths and make great art and entertainment. But I think they're humoured far too much today. And you know, you've got to learn your lessons. We saw the reactions to Man of Steel. We saw the reactions to BVS. The reactions to the Snyder Cut were a lot better. But it doesn't change anything. Zack Snyder is good at what he does. I love his films. I enjoyed Rebel Moon. But what you needed was a great writer to work with him. Someone really, really prolific. I mean, this kind of out there sci-fi movie could have really done with someone like Quentin Tarantino. Not that he's ever done sci-fi before. Just someone prolific to say to Zack, Zack, just be a director. Be a director and let me tell the story. Someone just needs to say to him, even at the ripe old age of, 58, 59, 60, 61 or whatever he is, you can't tell a story. You can tell your stories via your directing lens. That's what you're good at. And I think the more Zack tries to create his own world and tell the story as well as being a director, it's not going to work out for him. but his fans will watch this, as I did, and really, really enjoy it. And it has a brilliant cliffhanger at the end, and I'm sure the second part will be awesome too. But no one's ever going to hail Zack Snyder as a great storyteller. Well, his fans will. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be critics versus fans, and that's never going to change.